And just for those of you who are just coming in here, we are actually letting you choose your own adventure in the workshop today. And we have with us, we've had him several times before, Shaun Spalding. Welcome, Shaun. It's so nice to have you here. He's the director of New Media Rights. He's been working with the Rec Innovation Lab from day one, and we just are so grateful for everything that he's done and continues to do for us and for the entrepreneurs who are starting their startups here at the Rec Innovation Lab. And today we are going to be covering a topic of your choice. There's a poll going on right now, and we'll allow all of you to vote on what topic you'd like us to actually cover today. So you can choose three of the options, the following options: what lawyers do and don't do, business formation. We can talk about contracts with partners and founders, or contracts with developers, designers, and other. You can cover, or we can cover rather, terms of service, privacy policies, employment law, copyright, trademarks, anything that you want to cover. And oh wow, we had three clear winners, and that's changing a little bit. So
whoa,
yeah. So we'll see if we have more of you vote.
There might be an upset.
But 25 of you have voted. Oh yeah, so that changed a little again now. So we shall see. So what do you think, Shaun? Do you think we should close the poll? Do you want
why not? Let's do it. Like,
okay,
I feel like
close this poll here, and then that is the results.
The people have spoken.
They have spoken. And
okay, so contracts with developers, contracts with partners, and trademarks.
Trademarks.
By an inch. All right.
Right. Okay. So that looks like we're covering contracts and trademarks today. Contracts and trademarks. Sound good, Shaun?
Yeah, sounds good. All right. So my name is Shaun Spalding, Assistant Director of New Media Rights. Just so you know, we are a nonprofit. We're associated with one of the San Diego Law Schools, California Western School of Law. So we help a lot of entrepreneurs and startups and I guess lots of people who are trying to create new, innovative, educational, exciting projects, but can't necessarily afford $300, $400, $500 an hour for an attorney to make that happen. So those are a lot of the people who we work with. And so as a result, we have slightly different motivations than a typical private law firm. So for example, one of the biggest things is that the types of people we work with, because we work with them on a pro bono or very, very nominal fee basis, we basically don't make money from them. And so as a result, we don't necessarily have some of the economic incentives that lawyers might typically have in working with startups. And so whenever that makes sense to talk about the difference between what we might say as compared to a private firm, I'll try to point that out. So this is going to be part 2, I guess, of the Law 101 workshop. Some of you might have seen that, and some of you are new to the rec or just weren't in attendance, so you might not have. So I didn't want to go over things that clearly you all had already heard. I wanted to break some new ground, and so that's why I ended up doing the poll. One thing that's worth saying is that we can only really talk about pretty big picture generalities here, but if you, for example, contact us through our contact form at newmediarights.org, or if you sign up for one of our sort of general consultations, so typically they're an hour and maybe 10 minutes long, and we talk a little bit more about some of these issues as they may relate specifically to what you're doing. So although it's not necessarily legal advice, it is, hey, here are all the issues that your business model might have. Here are the things that you're going to encounter, and here are the things that you might change. And so a handful of students in the rec have taken advantage of it. It seemed like it was always a very fruitful thing. Unlike a lot of your other mentors who you might be working with, who are more concerned with product market fit or marketing or how much to charge or when to expand. We're less concerned about those things. We pretty much say you could do whatever you want, but what we do is that we tell you about some of the administrative difficulties that happen when you decide to do X instead of Y, right? If you, let's say that you, for example, want to develop an app with an app developer as opposed to using sort of an off-the-shelf solution. So there's a lot more hassles and a lot more time and energy that goes into making sure that the app that you develop is going to be legally sound compared to using an off-the-shelf solution. So those are the types of things that we might talk about. So you can go to bit.ly/NMR-consult, and there should be at least one more consultation open on, I think it's either the 29th or the 30th. If you do listen to this and there aren't any more open, I'd really encourage you to reach out to me at Shaun@newmediarights.org and let me know if you wanted to schedule a consultation before the 30th, because these are the last ones that are going to be open for a little while, and we want to make sure that everyone who wants to talk to us can. And if you are on the fence about whether or not you want to speak to us specifically, you can talk to one of the other members of the rec who have spoken to us and let them, you can talk about whether or not it was useful and in what ways. And finally, don't sign up if you really don't want to do it, because we don't have very many resources, and so cancellations cause a lot of problems. So if you're really, really interested in doing it, please do it. But if you're sort of on the fence, maybe contact us to see if you should do it or not.
And
right.
I will say this, Shaun, don't mean to interrupt, but I will say this, that if they do sign up and don't show up, they know that they are no longer able to book any appointments with mentors or with you for the rest of the summer cohort. So don't do that. Yeah, if you sign up.
I know no one would do that.
Yes.
Okay.
I also want to interrupt really quick too. This is Karen. I just want to say that Shaun was responsible for the pivot of my company, and it made the biggest, hugest difference in how we go about our business model. And it literally was responsible for the fact that we are so much better off with investors because of my time with Shaun. And Shaun, I haven't had a chance to thank you with Trendbook, but literally it was a huge game changer from starting from what we talked about, tier 3, and working backwards. And it literally just changed the game. So if you're on the fence,
appreciate that.
It was literally the biggest factor in the tipping point for me.
Well, you've heard it here first. What a ringing endorsement.
And I can vouch too. I love what she's done after she's pivoted. So thanks, Shaun. Thanks.
Yeah. And you can't pay for that type of endorsement. And so we also have a book. It's only like $12-13 on Amazon. It has a lot of sort of useful things that it might be worth checking out as background as you move through the process of getting independent contractors, business formation, contracts, etc. All right. So,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt one more time, but any of the students in the rec, they can buy the book through the link in the classroom, and it's actually a little bit of a discount for them too. So, yeah.
All right. Awesome. And so you've chosen your own adventure, so I don't need to talk about what all these things are. And the first thing that you chose was, all right, so contracts with internal partners. And so what I mean by this is co-founders and people like that. And so here's one of the things that is really, really difficult for us to actually talk about in a private session, because the one thing is that partners are aligned in terms of, hey, they both want the business to be a success, right? They might have, one person might have skill A and one person might have skill B, and so they really want to put those skills together and move forward. But their interests are somewhat misaligned in the fact that they both potentially have, for example, one partner can kick out the other partner. One partner can not pull their own weight. One partner might want to do a deal and the other person doesn't, and then you have a dispute. And so one of the largest issues for startups is the fact that they haven't decided how they're going to operate the business as two people. And so particularly, they haven't decided how they're going to dictate how compensation is given out, how ownership is given out, and how control is given out. And so let me tell you what I mean by these three things. All right. Compensation is how much does everyone get paid? But it's not just how much you get paid, right? It's if, for example, we form a corporation, how many shares do I get? It's if we get outside investment, how long does it take us to gain the equity that we say that we're going to get in the company? So that's called vesting. And so you can look that up on your own, but this is a really important thing because you just don't know when it is that you might get into outside investment. Compensation is also if you already make money, what is the nature of profit sharing and what is required for you to do it? And so right now, you might have a situation where you're thinking, oh, well, we'll just share everything 50-50. But what happens if your skill A is necessary to start the company, right? Maybe you have good contacts in a certain industry, but the other person's skill B is required to move the company forward. So their skill is the most useful thing day to day, and your skill becomes much less useful, right? Suddenly, the person who is doing the work day to day might feel as if you being compensated 50-50 is not all that even because you might be doing much less work. And so figuring this stuff out early on in terms of compensation is really key. What if you decide to split ways, right? Is the person who helped start the business still going to be compensated, and maybe for how long? Because if I used, for example, all of my contacts to help start the business, and that's what got it off the ground, maybe I don't want a situation where if I left the business that you get to now, the other person gets to reap the rewards of all of my contacts, and now I can't do anything with them because they're all working with you. So maybe I'd like to say, give me a percentage of how much money the company makes, or a continuing percentage of ownership of the company, et cetera. And so some of this might be worked out if you do end up forming a corporation or an LLC, because these things are part of the operating agreements, it's part of the memberships, it's part of the articles of incorporation, et cetera, of these types of businesses. But most of you are going to be starting as general partnerships, meaning that you don't necessarily have a formed entity that you register with the government. You're simply two sole proprietors trying to work together on a business to make a profit. And so for all these reasons, compensation is really, really important to talk about. And everybody is okay with talking about this when there's no money at stake. But then everybody is very, very not okay with talking about it when everyone sees a little bit of money, right? And so you might think of the people you're working with as colleagues, which you should, but you should also make sure that you think about what your relationship is very objectively. All right, let's talk about ownership. So the second portion of this. So ownership is who owns, for example, the assets of the company, so the physical assets. If we buy 2 chairs for the office, who owns the chairs? So in the context of an LLC or a corporation buying shares out of its bank account, it's very simple, right? The company owns the chairs, and then if the company is sold, we'd also sell the chairs, and that would go into the company's bank account. But if you don't have a formed entity and you buy 2 chairs, well, who bought the chairs and why, right? So now if, for example, we go out of business, who gets to keep them? This is very important from a proprietary standpoint, just because you might be paying for things out of pocket, right? And you want to be able to have an agreement as to how that goes. But the even more important part of this, since many of your businesses rely on intellectual property, is who owns the intellectual property. And so imagine a situation where you have 2 business partners who are going to create who have not yet created an LLC or a corporation or another form. And so they are just a general partnership. So to the extent that, for example, I am a designer and I create the logo, so I'm person A. Person A actually owns that logo. It's not necessarily the general partnership that owns that logo. Let's say person B now is integral in creating the website. Let's say they create the website on Squarespace and they take a handful of photos of the products for the website. And so now person A has created the logo, person B has created the website. We have a falling out. Now, what happens is that person A can take the logo with them. Person B can take the website with them. And if you think about that, suddenly no one can do any business because neither of you have the tools that it takes to remain in business because one person took the brand and the other person took the platform on which to sell the brand. And so this is why ownership is critical, right? Ownership of the company. So that's ownership of the intellectual property. How one might fix that is through a contract dictating who owns it, right? So you might say that person A will own everything, but promises to then give it all to the company once it's formed, right? You might have a situation where person A is a technical founder, so they might own all the code, and person B is a sort of conceptual founder, and that person owns all of the other intellectual property. And so anything that you figure out can potentially be feasible. It's just that you have to figure that out ahead of time. So now I've talked about ownership of assets, and I've also talked about ownership of intellectual property. Let's talk about ownership of the company. So this again talks about shares, right? If you have a corporation, who owns those shares? If you have an LLC, is the person going to be a member of the LLC who's the partner, or is the person simply going to be a what's it called? Someone who works for the LLC who happens to not be a member. Oh, hold on for a second. I'm trying to figure out how to get to this chat thing because it
And I was
seems
going to
like
say,
it's blowing up.
I will, I'll take care of the chat there, Shaun. You don't need to worry about it. I'll go ahead and put your email address in there. But we do have a lot of background noise coming on. I don't know if it's on your end or if it's somebody else's.
Okay. Yeah, it's probably on my end. Does it sound like talking?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Okay, because I'm trying to use this mic. Is this better?
Yes, it's much better. Yeah, much, much, much better.
Okay. All right. So where did I leave off before the background noise became too much?
Ownership of company.
Ownership of company.
Okay. So yeah, ownership of the company. And so ownership of the company is dictated by what form the company is in. So as an LLC, you might choose who is a member of the LLC as opposed to who is not a member. And by that, I mean who it actually is someone who takes responsibility for the company, right? So typically, co-founders might both be members of the LLC, but that doesn't have to be true. And so even if you don't currently have an LLC and it's maybe too expensive or too forward looking to start one right now, you should determine to what extent do you as a partner want to be part of the LLC, or do you want to simply work for the company? In a corporation, it's not membership, it's equity. And so one of the interesting things about a corporation is that more people can own a corporation. And so to the extent that someone owns a very, very small piece of it, right, you can say that, hey, I own the vast majority of it, but then you might own 10%, which is sometimes slightly different than how an LLC would work. Either way, it doesn't matter whether or not you know about the technical stuff. The whole thing that I'm trying to communicate is that you just need to have some idea of how you all are going to work together, because this is the one thing that rips companies apart and makes people have really bad feelings with each other if this stuff isn't worked out. And you don't necessarily need a lawyer to work any of this out, because if you've been listening, I mean, most of the things we were talking about, I mean, are relatively straightforward, right? It's like I can figure out who, if we just agree that when we actually form the company, that we all transfer the intellectual property to that company. That doesn't necessarily require a lawyer to explain the nuances of that. Of course, you could hire one, but it doesn't necessarily require that. And if you want to Google something that might help you, Google something like partnership agreement, because what I'm talking about right now, for most of you who haven't formed companies, you all are in general partnerships. And so these are all issues that would be spoken about in partnership agreements. And so if you write into Google top 10 issues with partnership agreements, what I should think about in my partnership agreements, checklist for partnership agreements, suddenly you'll find a lot of these issues that I'm talking about. All right, let me talk about control last, because it's both the most straightforward one and also potentially the most non-intuitive one. So let me give you a straightforward example of why talking about control is important. So let's say it's two partners who run a business, and one of those partners wants to really do a deal with, let's say, the airport, right? You have the airport program that's going, and the other person says, oh, this is not a good time to do a deal with the airport. There's a pandemic going. Let's wait and try to find another first partner. And so you have a very strong disagreement, because one person sees this as your big break and the other person sees this as something that could ruin the business. And so if there's only two partners, right, one person has one vote, one person has another vote, and suddenly this 50-50 vote will end in a tie. And what you'll have to do is dissolve the business, because there's actually no way, no actual way that you can resolve this. And so when I'm talking about control, I'm talking about figuring out ways to, number one, solve disputes. Imagine a situation where you agreed ahead of time. Person A makes all the technical decisions about money, and person B makes all creative decisions about the product, because that person knows the product much better. And so now you have an objective way to resolve this type of dispute, because person A would rule on this decision about whether or not to make the deal with the airline, because it seems as if it's a financial decision, right? And you don't need a lawyer to come up with that. You just need to know that issues of control are important. Here's another control. Here's another way you could solve one of those issues. Imagine for a second that you had this argument, but you agreed ahead of time that a third party, person X, can be brought in if there's a tie, if you need to have break a tie. So I think that we should do the deal with the airport. You think we shouldn't do the deal with the airport. Now this triggers our agreement that person X, who probably knows both of us and we've agreed to ahead of time, is the person who is the tie-breaking vote. And so that's really useful, because again, you don't have to dissolve the company. You don't have to strong arm someone and lose a lot of goodwill. And so again, control is really important. Control also can talk about whether or not someone can be pushed out of the company, right? So does person A have the right under certain circumstances to force person B out against their will? Does person B have a right to certain value from the company if person A forces person B out? Can person A agree to a deal without person B's permission? Can person A sign a contract without person B's permission? And so here's, again, a concrete example of what one of these partnership agreements might say. And again, it doesn't need to be a formal agreement, but it might say something to the effect of, hey, yes, you can sign contracts on the business's behalf, but any contract above $1,000 that you sign, you have to get permission from person B. And so now this gives person A a sense of flexibility, right? Yes, I can now sign contracts. And so I can sign up for Adobe Photoshop if I want to, and we'll all pay for it. But if it's over $1,000, let's say I'm signing up for a business internet plan that's going to cost $5,000 over the course of the year, then you have to get everyone's permission to do so. And so that's a really, really practical thing, and it's the type of thing that will set you up on the right foot. All right. So just a handful of bullet points that we talked about. Who makes key day-to-day decisions by the business? Do you need a majority vote? Let's say there's more than 2 partners. Do you need a unanimous vote in certain situations? Do you want to limit each partner's ability to do outside things? So can this, I mean, you all are probably running this stuff part-time, right? And this is going to be maybe a long time before you end up becoming so successful you can all quit your full-time jobs. And so can your partner start something that competes with this business, right? Can the partner have outside commitments, and to what extent do those outside commitments overlap or with your business or distract from your current business? All right. How much cash does everyone have to contribute in order to be considered a full partner? So let's say you're bringing on a third person who has skill set C that neither you nor your other partner has. This happens a lot in the context of app developers, which we're going to explain later when we talk about third-party contracts with designers and app developers. You might have someone who's so skilled and they become integral to your company, and you just need to keep them on. And so to what extent do these people need to give a certain amount of value in terms of assets or cash or work? So it's called sweat equity in order to become a partner. Because if you all have put in lots of time and energy and money in so far, they might need to catch up in order to get to the same place you're at. All right. So how is the sale of a business decided? That's a useful thing. You're wondering, wait a minute, we haven't even started yet. Why are we thinking about sale? It's because theoretically, you should be thinking about whatever the exit strategy for your business is. And so I imagine you might have even had speakers, mentors talking about exit strategies. And so is your exit strategy sale? Is your exit strategy an increasing amount of investment to get to a certain point where you can just work on this business for the rest of your life? Who knows? And so figuring that out means talking about it right now. And if you only think about it in a little complexity right now, it'll save you a lot of headache later on. All right. So last time I didn't get a chance for questions. So this time I'm going to integrate questions into the actual presentation. So does anybody have any questions? So not giving specific legal advice or anything like that, but general questions about what I've talked about so far. So feel free to unmute.
And before anybody asks their questions, I did want to say, by the way, sorry, this is Tanya. I wanted to say I just put in the chat a link to a survey, and so if you don't get a chance to actually ask your questions here, or if you have something a little bit more private to ask, you can also put that in there into the survey, and I'll share those results with Shaun. They'll be kept private, and that's all I'm going to say. So that link is there in the chat, and also, even if not, just please give us some feedback so that we can continue to offer content that you want. So that's my little bit. I'll leave you. Ask away your questions.
Okay. Oh, I'm just looking at this. Isaac, if you want to email me at shaun@newmediarights.org, you can just let me know that you wanted to open up a new slot, and it would have to be before the 30th, so on the 29th or the 30th.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Shaun.
Okay. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions regarding what I was talking about these ownership control and compensation questions with your potential partners? So
I had a quick question. So what do you think would be the best way to draft up these contracts? Like, could we potentially talk to you about drafting them up, or a third party law
yeah,
firm?
so there's three different options. So of course there's the formal option where you go to a law firm and then you ask them, hey, draft a business partner agreement, and then a lot of questions get asked, and finally you pay a couple hundred, probably a couple $1,000, and then you get this agreement in front of you. But there's also the informal way of doing that. And so the informal way of doing that is you you Google a handful of these issues, right? You Google what should be in a business partner agreement. You Google top 10 problems with business partners. You think about all of these three things, and then you come up with a handful of points written down in a Google document, and you say, this is basically what we agree to on these handful of issues, so that you could do that too, right? And you could just keep adding to the Google document over time. And so think about this as a continuum, right? On one continuum, you get expertise, but it costs a lot of money. On the other hand, you get flexibility, and then it doesn't really cost any money, but it just costs your time. And it potentially may be under-inclusive because you may lack, I mean, not you may, but you certainly lack expertise on how to answer these questions properly. And so somewhere in the middle, you can always go. So for example, there are legal clinics like ours that you can contact, which might not cost as much as a private attorney that you can work with. There are templated agreements that you could look at that, although you may not be able to know how to use them very well, you don't have to just make up everything. You can sort of use this as a jumping off point to see which questions are the questions that matter right now, and maybe ask specific questions of experts. So although, let's say, we or someone else might not draft it, you might then pose a certain level of questions like, oh, how do we deal with ownership of intellectual property? I don't really know the first thing about it. Maybe that's a specific question that you might ask someone like us that then allows you to help yourself because you have some understanding of some of these compensation and control issues. And so, yeah, I think that you could, just to give you the very short answer, you could totally contact a private law firm. You could contact someone like us and have us draft it. If we're available, you can do your own independent research and come up with something highly informal that basically answers your questions internally, but also allows you to be flexible and change these things until you figure out what works, or you can do something in the middle. Oftentimes, people who end up forming LLCs or corporations will have to make a lot of these decisions with their attorneys anyway, if attorneys end up forming these things. So you're going to be thinking about this type of thing less. For example, if you form your company, your LLC or corporation or whatever under LegalZoom, for example, a lot of people do that. And one of the issues with LegalZoom is not that it necessarily doesn't give you an LLC after you're finished with the process, but it doesn't give you the answers to all of these questions. And sometimes it doesn't even raise these questions. And often the answers to these questions are just as important as having the actual technical corporate form in place. All right, so that was a very, very long answer to your question, but hopefully it was useful. Any other questions before I move on?
Yes, Shaun, this is my name is John, and I was talking to my mentor the other day, and he wanted me to bring up the question: should we get legal advice before we kind of do our investor pitch outside of the rec? Because I know with the rec they kind of have the NDAs going, but if we talk to anybody outside, should we talk to the legal advice first?
Okay, I guess it really depends on what your goals are and what also you believe the issues might be. And so, I mean, there's lots of issues in talking to investors in the first place. There's security issues. And so if these people aren't necessarily accredited investors, you may, and they're also not friends, families, etc. You also may have issues going to them for investment. So that might be a threshold issue in which you would talk to an attorney about. So let's say you're just going to randomly start approaching people to invest in your project. That raises securities laws issues, and so that could be a threshold issue. But if the issues are more along the lines of how this investor pitch should work and what I need to have in place before I talk to investors, I think that could also be something that you could talk about, because you only have one chance with an investor, and so you don't necessarily want to be in a place where they ask you a question that you can't answer. And so let me describe what I mean by that. So number one, if you're talking to an investor and let's say you make an app, or your company is I don't know, a company that is a exercise program. So let's just talk about the app first, and let's talk about the exercise program in a second. So if I'm running an app and then the investor asks, well, do you own the intellectual property, right? Do you have a registered copyright for the software? And do you have a trademark for the software, the app's name, etc.? And so if you say no, you're going to look very bad, right? Is this going to be a mark against you when you're pitching to an investor? And the more marks you have against you, the more it looks as if you don't know what you're doing. And the more, if it looks like you don't know what you're doing, the less likely it is that you're going to be able to convince someone to give you money to do it. Let's say that you're a fitness company, and so you're going to a much different type of investor, right? Because most, I guess, large institutional investors are not interested in fitness companies because they're not the type of things that can scale in a major way. But maybe you still just want someone to give you $5,000-$10,000 or something, and these people are still going to have questions. And so a fitness company, let's say like CrossFit or Bikram Yoga, is the type of company that lives and dies based on its trademark. The reason why that Bikram Yoga makes so much money is that it can license its trademark to other studios, and they say, oh, I'm an official Bikram Yoga studio, or I am a official CrossFit studio. This is how they make money. And so to say to an outside investor that I haven't ever thought about trademarks before is, again, a mark against your favor. As a result, right, it's not necessarily required, right, that you talk to lawyers or anything like that before you go to see investors, but it seems very useful in many respects. And so I don't know if that answers your question or if that just adds more questions. But if it does add more questions, I'd feel I can elaborate if you'd like.
No, I think it did. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Going once, going twice. Unmute. All right, let's move on. Oh, unless I heard an unmute.
No, you're good, Shaun. You're good. You're good.
Okay.
No, it's just me. It's just me.
Okay, so let's talk about contracts with vendors, developers, designers, other third parties. And so one fundamental thing that everyone needs to know, since most people's businesses revolve highly around intellectual property, is that intellectual property transfers, particularly when I'm transferring ownership from the designer who made the illustration or the logo or took the photo to you as the business owner, have to be in writing. And so this is really important, because if you take away nothing else, it's that anytime you hire someone who makes creative work for you, you will always need an agreement, a written agreement with that person doing at least transferring the creative work to you. Of course, contracts with designers can have a lot of other things in it. For example, the scope of services, when things need to be delivered, and so on and so forth. But all of that is superfluous in some ways if you don't actually own the thing. And so I already brought up in my answer to the previous question why it's so important to own your intellectual property, because if you create a app company and your company revolves around the app and you don't actually own the app, then what do you really own about your company? If you are a fitness studio and you don't own your trademark, to the extent that the most important thing that gets people into the door, which is your brand name, and the most important thing that you could potentially license out or franchise, your logo, isn't actually yours, that's a huge problem. And so, again, big takeaway from this set of slides is if you do not currently have at least an agreement that transfers intellectual property from anyone who has designed anything for you before, anyone who has written anything for you before, anyone who's taken any pictures for you before, you should do that now, or at least as soon as possible, right? This is also true of your partners, because at this point, right, your partners, as I was talking about, are independently making certain things, right? Partner A writes all the stuff on the website. Partner B takes all the pictures on the website. Both of you now own the copyrights in the work that you made. Both of you could potentially walk away with those things. And so having a contract that basically states that at some point we will transfer these things to each other, or as soon as we create them, we both now jointly own them, etc. That's going to be a really good thing. And you don't necessarily need a lawyer to do that, assuming that, of course, it would be very, very helpful to have a lawyer to do that, but you don't necessarily need a lawyer to do that in order to get that accomplished. You just need to do independent research and know that this is an issue. Because if it's not resolved in any way, then it could be a huge problem. But if it's at least somewhat resolved, it can always be fixed later on. Again, I would hesitate to make a bold statement that every issue with intellectual property can be fixed later on, because if the business really revolves around intellectual property and really does nothing except for create, own, and resell intellectual property, it's going to be really, really, really hard to fix that, because you're basically trying to fix your whole business. So I would encourage you, if your business revolves mostly around intellectual property and not physical products and things like that, to really think about your contracts with external partners wisely. Let me talk about something that's not intellectual property. Let me talk about hiring someone to do a complex project. And so one thing that I think is really important is I think it's worth concentrating on your MVP. So by MVP, minimum viable product, it means that what is the least that you can do to make sure that at least one part of your idea works, and you're able to test it in the market right away and get people to potentially pay for it, and it be at least somewhat valuable to them. And so I think that many people enter into starting a business and they say, oh, I want a technology platform. I want to hire a developer to do X, Y, or Z. When really, you don't necessarily need to hire a developer, because there's all sorts of off-the-shelf solutions, right? Like, oh, I don't need a website developer when I can use Squarespace, because Squarespace potentially has 100% of the functionality that I would need in the website that I would need to be developed. And so thinking about ways to create an MVP around bringing in as few people as possible, especially people like developers who are going to be highly, highly technical. All right, so what if you do need to actually hire a developer? So here's the first thing that I think is non-obvious about hiring a developer. And so this influences everything that's going to be in the agreement that I'm talking about. So all these points on screen right now are going to be influenced by the fact that if you ask someone to develop an app, it's not as if you're buying an app, right? The person develops it, and development is going to be a process without an end. And so something gets developed, and then you launch the site, and then one person uses it, and you realize that it crashes, and you need to fix it again, right? And so 6 months later, 50 people use it, and you realize that it crashes when 40 out of 50 people, 10 out of 50 people use it. So you need to fix it again. You're also probably adding new functionality. You're probably adding new features because you realize, oh, well, I'd like the thing on the top left instead of the top right because it looks like most people are clicking on the top left and can't find this button, right? Or you might decide that you're going to tweak performance or do all sorts of other things that you didn't think about doing initially when it was first made and no one was using it. At the end of the day, what happens is that even after launch, someone who is working in a complex situation like a developer is going to be constantly still working with you. And so if you're working with developers, you're going to slowly realize that these people are basically part of your team now. They're becoming partners because you may not have enough money to pay them. And so the only way that you can compensate for someone for essentially working for free, doing lots of skilled work, is to potentially give them equity or profit sharing or something else. And so this is going to be really tough because, as your mentors have probably told you, and as you're learning in the rack, you don't want to give away parts of your company very much. And so again, it's like, the threshold question is, do you even need to hire a developer right now in this current iteration of your company? And if you're MVP, you should try very hard to figure out an MVP of your company which doesn't actually require this type of person. But now let's assume that it does. Well, here are all the things that you would need to potentially talk about. And so these things are true not only of developers, but also of lots of other different types of people. So you're going to have to talk about deliverables. So when is the thing that you're making, or at least the first version, going to be sent to me, right? And typically complex projects are in milestones. So for example, we have phase 1, which is 2 months later, where we give out the wireframes. And so that might be a non-functional version that just shows you how things will be basically laid out. And then month 3 will be a prototype. So things are functional, but it doesn't really look like it's supposed to. And then finally, 3 months, 6 months later, it'll be the sort of alpha version, which is here's everything where it's supposed to look, and not necessarily how it's supposed to look in the final version, but as close as possible before it's ready to go public, etc. And so you want to be relatively specific because every single complex project, regardless of what it is going to have problems with what's called scope creep. So you can look that up in Google. Don't have enough time to talk about that, but it's everybody starts adding new features, everything starts taking a little bit more time. And if you're trying to get to an MVP, you don't want things to take any more time than they need to, right? You don't want to increase the complexity of the project. And so deliverables keep everybody honest and also keep everyone from spending too much time and work on something that you haven't even proven works yet. Timing is also important, right? If you want to actually go out and maybe try to find an angel investor, at some point you need to time that well so you have the beta version done by that time, even if you don't have other things done. Minimum standards. So oftentimes you don't exactly, if you're a non-technical founder and you're hiring a developer, you don't exactly know what it is that you need, but you're in luck because you know a lot of things that you don't want. Hey, I don't want this to take more than X amount of time to do. I don't want this to cost more than X amount of money. I want this to, at minimum, be able to work with 100 people using the app at one time. And so the more things that you know, basically, if it doesn't meet the threshold, then it's bad and it's wrong. You should agree with those things up front or come up with those things up front. because I think a lot of people try to figure out what they do want, right? And so that's always going to be a moving target because you haven't tested it until you know what the users actually want. But you do know what you don't want, all right? Technical support. Imagine you're a non-technical founder and now you have 100 people per day using your software, but you actually don't know how your software works. This is a realistic thing that can happen to you. And how can you possibly give technical support on something that you don't even really understand how to use yourself? This is, again, another reason why people become beholden to their developers, and developers often end up as part of the team, right? And again, going back to the idea of bringing new people onto the team, this is why you might have a structure around how to bring new people onto the team. It's because these people are going to need to start answering technical support questions. They need to be around to do it, and you need to get some sort of buy-in from them that says, hey, 6 months from now, even though you're done with the project, you still might be handling some of these support questions. Are you willing to do that or not? Because if you're working with someone who is not willing to do that, then that's cause for pause to think about, well, maybe I'll just have to wait until I work with someone who can do that. Same thing's true with updates, right? Again, I want to move this button from here to here because suddenly once I move it, it will make it 5% more likely that people will buy the product, right? That seems like an important update that you'd want to make. And so they need to be around to do it. Because another thing that technical founders don't necessarily understand or completely appreciate is that updates are difficult, right? So you're like, oh, move this button from here to here. And then they say, oh, well, that'll take 2 weeks and that'll cost $2,000. And you're like, why? And it's because you can't necessarily appreciate what it means to change certain aspects of what's there. The second thing is, someone might say, oh, well, if this person won't do it, then I'll just get someone else to do it. And so this is another issue where you end up in a situation that it's very, very difficult to move code from one developer to another developer because code isn't necessarily completely straightforward. There are certain standards for how code should and shouldn't be written, but you can write code in a lot of ways where those standards don't necessarily apply, but the code still works. And so to transfer it from one person to another leads to a situation where it will take the person you transferred it to a very, very long time to get up to speed. And once it takes that person a long time to get up to speed, it generally costs more money, right? And so to get someone else to do it is often not a feasible thing to do, particularly if you don't have much cash, right? And so again, if you talk to someone who's helping you do this and they're mostly unwilling to continue some sort of level of service for technical support and updates, again, it's a cause for pause. And then we already talked about the ownership issue. So we're running out of time, so I want to see if there's any questions before I jump into the next section about trademarks.
Hi, Shaun. Sorry to interject for a minute. I'm just going to put the feedback form in the chat one more time, if people can fill that out when they get the chance. It won't be available afterwards, so make sure you at least copy the link before.
Are you talking to me about copying the link?
No, I meant anyone who's going to fill out the survey.
Okay.
Because once you log off, you won't be able to access the chat. So if people could even just like copy the form right now, and then you can fill it out afterwards. Sorry to interrupt.
Thanks for that, Lena. Yeah.
Nope. Any questions? Right. Going once. Going twice. Anybody unmuting? All right. So just to finish this up, when talking about contracts with outsiders, so people who aren't your partners, lots of ways that you can engage in self-help. So again, when I talk about like an agreement between the developers, it can either be a formal agreement that you paid an attorney to make, or it can be, hey, I've done independent research, I've agreed to lots of these things in the Google document, they've agreed to it as well, and now this is how we're working. Or it can be something in between. So you might contact us and say, hey, I don't know very much about what the deliverable should be. What should I say? And then we might reply and tell you, hey, this is what is typical in people who do things like this. This is what you could do, or here's another alternative. And then you make the decision yourself. Other things that you can do is get sample agreements of other people who are mentors in the industry, right? So if someone who's done exactly what you've done has hired a developer before, this person is going to be able to tell you a lot of the things that might be useful. They might tell you war stories about things that went wrong. And so that's also extremely useful, especially if you don't have access to or the resources to get a lawyer. All right, moving on. Last thing that eked into the final, we have what, 10 minutes, 5 minutes? How long do we have left?
Sorry
Tanya,
that I was muted and I forgot that I was muted.
Huh?
So, let's, if you need 10 minutes, I can just let the next group know, and those who can stay can stay.
Okay. Is it over already? I don't know.
Technically, we're over already.
Oh gosh.
But,
all right. Well, I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. This is so useful. I mean, I don't want to rush it. Those of you who can stay, please do stay. We'll be recording this, so if you want to spend a little bit of extra time, and then I'll go ahead and coordinate with the next students. So.
All right. Well.
Yeah. And if you have to leave, we understand. But yeah.
Oh no, I don't have to leave. But if you all have to leave.
let's take another 10 minutes to finish it up for those who can.
Okay. Yeah. Let's just talk about trademarks and again, if you want to. Going back to the bit.ly link, I think they're all now taken, but if you want to have a sort of one-on-one talk on either June 29th or June 30th, and there are no more openings on the Calendly, please contact me here, send me an email, say, hey, these 2 or 3 times work on either June 29th or June 30th, and we can see if we can accommodate for that, because it'd be cool to make sure that you can. What happened to my thing? I'm sorry, hold on, please. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. Sorry. All right, so while I'm pulling this back up, let's talk about trademarks. And so, very basics of trademark law. Trademarks are here. Of course, they're here to protect businesses, right? You might already know what a trademark is in the context of like a logo for, I don't know, a sports team, or a logo of the Coke can. But like, why do you actually have this? And it's because we want to make sure that consumers actually know the products that they're buying. It's not just for the idea that we want to protect businesses, but we want to protect consumers. So for example, if I go to a store and I want to buy a soda that's made from the Coca-Cola company, I pick up a can that's red and it says Coca-Cola in a store, and then I know that it's from the Coca-Cola company. And this is because trademarks are here to make sure that that happens, and you just don't buy something randomly and you're tricked into buying something that's of lower quality or from a different company, because consumer confidence would go down and people would stop buying things, right? There'd be no way for people to trust the things that they buy. And so trademarks are valuable to you because they're the things that make people want to buy your thing instead of another thing. Louis Vuitton, they have very nice bags, right? Like, they're probably much better than a cheap cheap purse, but they're not so much better that they should be 10 times the price of another well-made bag. But what makes them so much more expensive is because of the trademark. And so I won't get into too many wonky details about how trademarks work, but here's the question that most people have. How do I figure out if trademark registration is actually worth it, right? Because it's going to cost $2,000-$3,000 to potentially file your LLC. It's going to be another $1,000 to potentially file your trademark. If you're paying a lawyer, it could be more than that. Just fees alone are $300, $600, $800 to file a trademark. And so a lot of people either talk to private attorneys who are trademark attorneys who are like, you should file your trademark immediately, right now, first day. And then, or they decide, well, filing a trademark is not necessarily useful, so I'm just going to kick the can along the line and never really register a trademark. And so here's how you meet in the middle. Number one, it's worth understanding that trademarks, you already have protection as soon as you start selling something in commerce. And so what that means is that if I had a restaurant named I don't know, Wildflower Sushi, to the extent that people in my city know what Wildflower Sushi is, there couldn't be another restaurant that started called Wildflower Sushi with a very similar logo, because I would already have automatic trademark rights in that name. What the automatic trademark rights don't give is rights to the name nationally. So I can have Wildflower Sushi in San Diego, but someone else can have Wildflower Sushi in New York. And so because we both have trademark rights only in the place that we do business, neither of us conflicts. And so the issue is for registration, that registration gives you national protection, right? So now I can start a Wildflower Sushi anywhere in the country. Or more along the lines of what you all are doing, I can now market on the internet anywhere in the country and have a certain level of protection. So this is how you kind of start figuring out whether or not paying the $1,000 or more for registration is useful, right? How valuable is the name to your business? Well, if you're like a fitness studio, like I've used the example before, the name is incredibly valuable because it's really the only thing that separates you from another studio, right? Your methodology for how to do fitness, like CrossFit, the way that you decide to heat the yoga room and the different yoga poses for Bikram yoga. So this name is so valuable to the business that it's hard to think of having the business without it. And so maybe that person might lean towards registering a trademark even before they file an LLC, right? And maybe a person who has an app, and the app basically is just some random word that they decided that has nothing to do with the actual quality of the app or its functionality, that person might change their name 2 or 3 times before they end up going public with it. So that person probably wants to kick the can down the line and think about registration much later. All right, you weigh that against how much money could be used to do something more important, because there's lots of administrative and bureaucratic things involved in starting your company, right? And a trademark registration is one of the few things that doesn't make you money, right? Buying more product, getting more inventory could potentially make you more money. Marketing and advertising can make you more money. Registering a trademark just costs you money and time. And so to the extent that you would rather use that money for something else, well, then maybe weigh that against how valuable it is. And then finally, how soon do you need to take advantage of the registration, the benefits you get from registration? So for example, going back to what I was saying about investors, if you know you're going to go out and try to get some angel investors or the like, these people are going to want to know whether or not you've thought about your intellectual property. And to the extent that you've thought about your intellectual property, you should have a strategy. And that strategy usually is, oh, I've already registered, or I plan to register on X date because of Y, right? And you don't necessarily know that unless you've thought about it before. And so you're sort of weighing these things in the triangle consistently and making a decision based on how to weigh those different factors.
I have a question, Shaun, about trademarks. This is Karen.
Yep.
So I was doing some research on the United States trademark, the main one that's just bigger than the state, it's the country's
Yeah,
site.
the USPTO, so the National
Yeah,
Registration, the US Patent and Trademark Office.
right. So I know that they're saying that there's different forms, like different prices and different things based on how, if you want to register all at once or if you want to do it in steps where it costs more over time. I think it was saying if you do it all once, it's like $230, and if you wait, it's $275, and then it only goes from there. But I know that they're requiring certain amount of things in order to file all at once to be prepared. Do you have any tips and advice on what to expect or what to have before starting the process? Because I plan on doing that today, but I guess.
So yeah, so general tips. I think the first thing is to understand that trademarks generally require use, and so there's you're putting together two different concepts. So the first concept is use or non-use, and so if you're using something, it's going to be much more straightforward to register it because you basically register it once and then you're done with it. If you are currently not using it but intend to use it at a certain point, right? Imagine a brand that is about to launch a new detergent, right? They're launching it in 4 months, but they want to be able to protect it when it goes on retail stores, so they start the registration early. And so to the extent that they're not using it yet, but they still want to file a trademark, then they have to file a different type of application. And so sometimes people who believe that they're using a mark actually aren't using a mark. So for example, let's say I sell t-shirts, right? I'm just like, I screen print t-shirts at home and sell them. Well, you think like, oh, well, my logo is clearly the screen print on there is clearly a trademark. But every registration requires a specimen. So that means like an example of the thing that you put the mark on. And so you couldn't necessarily use that screen printed t-shirt because instead it has to be on the label of the shirt itself. So it's like, oh, I manufactured the shirt and it's on the shirt itself. Because what the trademark office is looking for is not simply just a design on a shirt or the like. They're looking at it is literally the source of the goods and how it is labeled. And
So for example, are you basically saying that like if somebody was doing a virtual service or something online where basically their logo is just a part of their brand, it's more of a non-use because it's not like they're selling, like you said, selling things with the brand's label, or is that something different?
So as soon as it's in the online context, it's a little bit easier to understand because if you say this is an online course, for example, sold by, let's say you have a company called Knowledge Base, right? And you sell an online course and it's called First Steps in Doing Yoga, right, for beginners. And so if you submit First Steps in Doing Yoga for Beginners to the trademark office as a specimen, they'll probably say no. But if it's Knowledge Base's first, Knowledge Base presents first blah, 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 beginner yoga, then that is something that is now labeled with the mark, right? It's a product that's being sold that now people associate the name Knowledge Base with that course. And so that would be more likely to be a specimen. And so one would show, here is the listing that I call it this in their registration. That would be more likely a use registration. And so the other piece of this is classes. And so if you're formally registering a mark with the USPTO nationally, you don't necessarily have you don't get, if I am a restaurant called Wildflower and there's a construction company also called Wildflower in San Diego as well, then potentially we don't compete in trademarks because a average consumer would never believe that my sushi restaurant is the same thing as your bulldozer company, right? Again, trademarks are about consumer confusion, and if there's no way that consumers can be confused, then we don't have trademark issues. And so when you register a trademark, trademarks are registered not for the word itself, but for a specific minute set of classes that the word could be in. And so imagine for a second, I'm a video game company and I have Assassin's Creed coming out. So Assassin's Creed might be in the classes of merchandise, right? Or particularly like vinyl merchandise for like those little Funko Pop dolls that they have. It might also be in video games and amusements, right? Because it's mostly a video game. It might also be in film and television because they also made an Assassin's Creed movie. And so you're going to pick the classes that make the most sense the first time you register, but you might subsequently register in other classes as you begin to use the mark in other ways.
Right.
And so this is another nuance that opens up the question of what is your strategy for registration? Going back to what I was saying, it's like, when do you need to take advantage of the benefits of registration? Do you only need one class for the next 8 months? Well, then only register the one class for the next 8 months.
Right.
And so this timeline here is all about places where it might start making sense to register a trademark. And so let's say you have a fitness app and you soft launch it. Well, you could change the name of your app, right? Maybe you haven't done any marketing to make people know what the name of the app is in the first place. So maybe it's not worth doing it. So now you fully launch, but you're not making any money. So you're on the left side of this triangle, left bottom side of this triangle, that you could be spending your money on doing lots of other important things, because right now at full launch, we still haven't made $1, right? You're expanding on your own. And so finally you're working with, let's say, Peloton, right? This might be an external partner. As soon as you're working on Peloton, you might have to sign an agreement with Peloton that says all sorts of things. At this point, right, if you know that this deal is a month, 3 months away, that's exactly the amount of time that it takes to start thinking about trademarks, right? 3 months in advance. And so, yes, now, since we bring on this big external partner and this deal can mean a lot of money, that means my brand, my name is worth a lot of money. And so I should spend the money to be able to protect it and be able to assert myself in whatever negotiation I have with Peloton, and maybe even be able to adhere to the contract that Peloton has, right? But maybe I have outside partners who don't really care about my mark. And now at the end, I'm pitching to outside investors. And so this, again, might be a time where it's worth doing it. And so don't necessarily just assume because some lawyer says, oh, you have to do it right now, that you have to do it right now. But you're sort of always weighing these things. And it's good to ask people with expertise, including lawyers, hey, do you believe that one of these things outweighs the other? And so this, if anything, is the conversation that you're having with private attorneys. Hey, tell me how valuable you think this is. Tell me if you think that I could use this money for something more important, and tell me what benefits do I legitimately get right now that I can use right now compared to benefits that I might get later. So this is how you'd have the conversation with your attorney to better have this conversation rather than just asking them what they want, because every trademark attorney is going to say, well, you should register a trademark. And why? Is because they're trademark attorneys, and so they see the value of trademarks and they also want your money, right? Of course. All right, so that...
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, we are running pretty close on time, so...
Yeah, so that's it. That's it. We're done. We're done. That was trademarks.
So, I'm sorry, somebody else was speaking there?
Yeah, did anybody have any questions?
Final thoughts or questions? Thank you so much, Shaun. That was wonderful. Karen, did you want to say something there?
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you, Shaun. I appreciate your time.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care. And yeah, hopefully you all email me if you want just like a one-on-one at some point between the 29th and the 30th. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Yes, yes. And I will just say, everyone, make sure to copy everything in the chat right now if you want it, so that you can actually have access to it. Once I close this, we'll be done. So go ahead and take a copy of the survey, take Shaun's email, or reach out to me afterwards if you have any trouble with it. But gosh, it was great. Again, always,
Bye,
Shaun,
everybody.
you on. Thank you. Bye, everybody. We'll see you for the next one. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.